very much for joining us in the York Festival of Ideas. My name is Noreen Mujege. I'm from the University of York. And today I'm chairing this very interesting talk on how racism is making us ill. And it is a pleasure, my great pleasure, to welcome you today. Before I introduce our speaker, it is my great pleasure to introduce you to our speaker for the day, Layal Liverpool. Layal is a journalist whose work spans diverse science topics including technology, physics, the environment, and health, with a particular focus on inequalities in science, health, and medicine. Her writing has appeared in Nature, New Scientist, Wired, The Guardian, and elsewhere. Before moving into journalism, Layal worked as a biomedical researcher at the University College London and the University of Oxford. She has a PhD in virology and immunology from the University of Oxford. Today she'll be talking to us about her first book, which is Systemic: How Racism is Making Us Ill, an investigation into the shocking facts behind the role of racism in medicine and scientific research. So over to you.
Thank you so much, Noreen. And thank you everyone for coming. I really appreciate your interest. It's really, really great to be here at the festival. And the book is out actually for 2 days, so it's available. I think there's some copies, thank you so much. So I wanted to use this time to talk about this crisis really in public health, which I think doesn't receive enough attention. I recently became a mom. Actually, you saw my son just had to evacuate just now. But you know, this is something I've been thinking about, especially going through pregnancy, that we are living in a world where there are enormous inequalities when it comes to maternal health, but also health in general. Globally, between, for example, European countries in Africa and Asia, there are very big inequalities in terms of maternal mortality and access to maternal health. But even within, wealthy countries like here in the UK, there are inequalities. So these statistics are for the UK. Between 2016 and 2018, black women were 4 times more likely to die during pregnancy and childbirth. And there are also inequalities for mixed race and Asian women. And this is something that bothered me even before becoming pregnant. There are also inequalities when it comes to pregnancy loss and to access to fertility treatment, so across the board, and then also in early life. So it was something that, being a science journalist, but also having a background in medical research, I felt really compelled to investigate further, and I wanted to take that kind of scientific approach to understand. I think obviously these issues have a political aspect, and sometimes the discussions escalate, but I think coming back to the science and just asking what is the data on this was really important to me. And I was even shocked by what I found. I thought I knew a lot about this, but there was a lot that I also learned in the course of researching the book and interviewing people. So there are inequalities not just during maternity, but across the board when it comes to health. So from infectious diseases like COVID-19, but also HIV, we were just talking about this before, but also in cardiovascular disease, so heart disease, stroke, diabetes, cancer, and even mental health conditions. Across all these areas, we see that in the UK, but also in the US and in countries around the world, we see that people belonging to marginalized racial and ethnic groups tend to experience poorer health outcomes. And it's something that is increasingly being recognized also by global scientific and medical authorities as a public health crisis, which I think is important, because it means by recognizing the problem, it means that we can then direct resources and prioritize it as something to tackle. So, for example, the medical journal The Lancet has recognized racism as a public health emergency, and recently The Lancet published a series of articles examining how racism, discrimination, and xenophobia affect people's health outcomes. but also the World Health Organization has highlighted inequalities affecting populations experiencing discrimination. Importantly, these social determinants of health. I think it's something that during COVID-19 was more discussed. There was more recognition, for example, of the fact that I'll use examples from the UK since that's where we are, but that people of Black and Asian ethnicity were experiencing worse outcomes, and I think it's important when we have those discussions to be informed about what are the factors that are driving that. I think there was a lot of effort to look, for example, for genetic explanations for these health gaps, when I think that sometimes the simplest explanation is the right one. And of course, I value genetics research, it's really important. But when there are such enormous inequalities and racism affecting our lives, that affects our health too. And the evidence shows that racism really is the cause of health inequality. So I wanted to share a bit about my own experience, because this is something that I started to think about actually long before I became a scientist and also a journalist reporting on these issues. So as a teenager, I grew up actually in the Netherlands, but I later moved to the UK for university. My parents are British. And yeah, as a teenager, I developed these patches that were itchy on my skin, on my arms and face. I started to lose pigment, and this is something that I was worried about. It was kind of mildly irritating, but also, being a teenager, you just want to look cute and feel nice. And so it was also a bit like cosmetic. I was just wondering what's happening, and my wonderful mom, who's here today, took me to see doctors. So I was fortunate that we had access to healthcare and everything, so we were able to try and figure out what's going on. But even with that, great healthcare, we really struggled for years to kind of get a diagnosis. I was prescribed lots of different things that didn't help. And then eventually I moved to the UK as an adult and to come to university, and I was living in London, which is a bit more diverse than where I grew up in the Netherlands. So eventually I was seen by a doctor who just happened to have darker skin, similar to my brown skin. And immediately he looked at me and he said, "Oh, this is a classic case of eczema or atopic dermatitis," which is a very common condition. Probably many of you have heard of it or even experienced it. And that really surprised me because I had kind of grown used to the idea that I must have some sort of rare, difficult to diagnose condition. And he was the one who said that perhaps the doctors I'd seen up to that point might have struggled to recognize it because the way it was manifesting on my skin, particularly on darker skin, is something that they might not have been used to or might not have been trained to recognize. So that has been in the back of my mind. But then researching the book, I got to know a lot of people who've had experiences much worse than what I went through. And I kind of realized that this is part of a bigger problem affecting our health and in medicine. So I got to know a young British Nigerian woman named Kanayo who several years ago experienced a life-threatening condition called Stevens-Johnson syndrome. Which can be really, really dangerous, it affects organs, but it presents on the skin. And she went to A&E multiple times, again, struggling to get a diagnosis, and she feels again that there was a failure of healthcare workers to recognize the condition on her skin, which is also kind of brown skin. And she has since been campaigning as a patient advocate to help people who have experienced that condition, but also to help doctors to learn what that can look like on diverse skin tones. But obviously these are stories and anecdotes, and I think they're so important. I think we should listen to people's stories and experiences. But being a scientist, I'm also interested in the data and research, and thankfully there is a lot of good research in this area. Especially in the last few years, I think there's been more attention to this issue in medicine and in research, which I'm really grateful for. So this is a study from the US, which showed that 75% of the images in medical textbooks showcase health conditions on lighter skin tones, and just 5% showcase conditions on darker brown skin. Also, there was a survey done later of users of this international medical teaching platform. So medical professionals from around the world were surveyed about how they feel diagnosing conditions. And only 5% of them said that they felt really confident in diagnosing skin conditions across diverse skin tones. That figure for me, the second one, was really shocking because it's such a low number, and it made me realize that perhaps this problem, it isn't a case of individual healthcare workers missing something, but actually it's a systemic problem affecting medical education and what we've done. Here in the UK, the NHS is extremely diverse. There's a lot of representation in terms of the workforce, but I think if we're learning from textbooks and education sources that aren't diverse, then that will still lead to health inequality. So I think this is a really important area where we can improve things. But I also wanted to talk about other aspects of medicine where biases can creep in. This is a story about Kevin Henry, who's an American football player in the National Football League, or NFL. The reason I brought his story is because he experienced head injuries from playing football, which in recent years there's been a lot of research linking head injuries to later life problems such as dementia and other traumatic effects on the brain. So he unfortunately experienced this and was forced to retire early, and he's showing mild signs of dementia and was diagnosed with that by his doctor. But unfortunately, although the NFL has actually been sued by former players and agreed to a kind of settlement program where they pay compensation to players who have experienced injuries and dementia, in Kevin's case, they refused to pay him compensation because they said that his doctor didn't adjust his cognitive test results in a process known as race norming. So race norming of neuropsychological tests assumes that black people start out at a lower level of cognitive function compared to white people. And its use by the NFL was making it more difficult not only for Kevin but for all black players to qualify for compensation, because they needed to prove that they'd experienced injuries through their career. So this for me was also really shocking to discover, but I think and I should say that the NFL has changed their guideline. So this was a story from 2021 where they said that they would end this practice after Kevin and other players sued them. But what the NFL said at the time was that, well, we didn't invent this. This comes from medicine. This is a standard in neuropsychology, and we're just following those guidelines. So that was really shocking to me because at the time I interviewed a neuropsychologist in California in the US, and I asked her about this. I said, oh, it's great news that the NFL is removing this kind of racist guideline. And she's the one who told me that actually this is quite widely used in medical practice still. So even though the NFL has stopped using it, this could still be affecting black patients throughout the country. So in a way, this story, because these players are famous in the US and they're well known, that kind of brought this to wider attention. But it kind of shows that there are a lot of these biases happening in medicine under the surface that we might not know about. And perhaps it doesn't need saying, but I'd like to emphasize that, of course, differences in cognitive test scores that have been observed, for example, in the US in the past, are not due to the fact that black people's brains work differently or that black people are less intelligent, but of course it's due to social inequality, racism, access to education, and this has been widely documented in studies. Assuming that people start at a lower level of cognitive function has no basis in science. And of course, race is a social construct, but racism can affect our health and our biology. So that's what I wanted to emphasize with this example. Unfortunately, it's not just in neuropsychology. Actually, across medicine, for a long time there have been guidelines recommending that doctors adjust patients' medical tests or even treatment guidelines based on their race, or perhaps the doctor's perception of their race, because it isn't clear how to define race, actually. If you think about it, so my parents are originally from Ghana. When I'm in Ghana, sometimes people call me Obrone, which actually means white person, and here in the UK, I'm perceived as black, I'm from mixed background, so race is obviously something that varies in time and place, and I think that's why people say it's a social construct. But unfortunately in medicine, doctors are then in a position where they're supposed to sort of racialize their patients and then make treatment decisions based on this. And a lot of the doctors I interviewed for the book don't support these ideas, but they're in a difficult position when there are guidelines telling them that they need to make adjustments based on race. So for years, doctors have been adjusting, for example, kidney function test results and lung function test results based on race. Although thankfully this is something that is changing, and I'd like to talk more about that in a moment. But yeah, before I talk about that, I wanted to talk a bit I've talked about healthcare and medicine, and there are a lot of biases there, and I think that's an area that attracts a lot of interest. But I think that before the moment when you end up in A&E or you are in the doctor's office, health is something that happens way before that. It's our living environment. It's what we wake up in the morning. What do we eat for breakfast? What kind of food environment do we have access to? What kind of air are we breathing, for example? And some of you might have heard of Ella Kissy-Deborah. So Ella sadly passed away in 2013 at the age of just 9 because of a really severe form of asthma that was caused by air pollution in the area of London where she lived. And she became the first person to have air pollution listed as part of her cause of death. But I interviewed her mother, who has done brilliant work campaigning for clean air in London and beyond. And she says that it's actually a scandal that not more people have air pollution listed as part of their cause of death, because it's really a kind of invisible and silent killer here in the UK, but also in other countries. And I think that it's an example of how environmental racism can affect our health. And I think this is a form of systemic racism. So racism embedded in the systems, structures, and institutions that underpin our society. So of course medicine is part of society, and I think it's important that we look at how bias in medicine affects our health, but I also think it's important to think about just our whole society. Obviously we're coming up to an election, so I think people are thinking a lot about change and what can we do to improve things. And I think just improving general society, making things fairer, improving the environment will be beneficial to everyone's health. I think Ella's story, obviously again, it's a single story, but it is part of a wider pattern of inequality. So this is a report from Friends of the Earth, an environmental campaigning network, about England. So people of colour in England are more likely to live in highly polluted areas, and also black children and adults like Ella are more likely to be hospitalised for asthma in the UK. So these inequalities are obviously connected, and racism underpins a lot of that. Racism also obviously drives economic inequality, which is connected to all of these opportunities, where we live, what food we have access to, the air we breathe. There's similar inequalities in other countries. So this is a study from the US showing that black and Hispanic people in the US are also more exposed to polluted air, even though they contribute less to its production. So there's also that inequality. And again, in the US too, you see inequalities in asthma, which is very much connected to air pollution, but also with other conditions such as lung cancer, which have been linked to air pollution exposure. So I think it's important to recognize how those inequalities in our daily life affect health. And beyond these systemic inequalities, economic and environmental inequalities, which are connected, of course, to the history of racism in the UK and in other countries, there's also just things that we experience in our day-to-day life. So just daily, I think what's sometimes called microaggressions, I'm not such a big fan of that term because I think it's actually quite macro. I mean, these things really affect people's lives, but just even small things as I go into a shop and I'm being followed because there may be stereotypes about black people are more likely to steal. These things, it affects you, or maybe you're randomly checked, or these sorts of experiences that a lot of people have. There is evidence that can really affect you. It can increase your stress levels, affect your blood pressure, and that again links to some of the conditions where we see higher prevalence in groups who are discriminated against, such as hypertension, cardiovascular disease. But also racism-related stress has been linked to even breast cancer and, of course, mental health conditions. That's a huge area. And I'm happy to also talk about that more. I'm definitely going to leave lots of time for questions and discussion. So in addition to all the kind of health gaps that we see and the biases in medicine, unfortunately there are also biases kind of upstream of medicine when we look at medical research. So when it comes to who is included in medical studies, who has the opportunity to participate, for example, in genetic studies or clinical trials. And I think that's important because it excludes people from the opportunity to benefit from medical research. So there's evidence that people who receive medical treatment in research-active institutions and hospitals tend to have better health outcomes. but often ethnic minority groups, marginalized groups are excluded from that, sometimes due to their living area or just having access to those opportunities to participate. There's also, I'm not going to go into it today, but there's also a long history of exploitation in medicine and in medical research of people of color especially, which can really lead to mistrust of some of these authorities. So I think it's so important, those of us who work in medical research, that we think about that and think how we can rebuild that trust and engage people in research. But on top of that, there's also evidence that increasing diversity, particularly in genetic studies, leads to better science. So we have more potential to make new genetic discoveries, and that's because genetics is really the study of human variation. So you might have heard that 99.9% of our DNA is the same, but that 0.1% that varies between individuals is really what geneticists are interested in, because that's where you have an opportunity to, for example, take a group of people who are experiencing disease and a group who don't have that disease, and to make comparisons and ask which genes differ or how do the genes vary between those two groups, and what can we learn from that in terms of helping those people and maybe developing new treatments. And so about, I think almost 80% of the participants in genetic studies around the world are of European descent. Just 2% of participants are of recent African descent. And so that inequality is problematic, particularly because all humans originated in Africa and we migrated outwards to populate the rest of the world in our kind of evolutionary history. And so because of that, there's a lot more genetic diversity among African populations compared to the rest of the world. And so by excluding participants, particularly from Africa, but in general from around the world, missing diversity, it creates a kind of selection bias, where we might bias the findings, and these might be less applicable to everyone. So this is an area where I think we can improve a lot, and thankfully there's also efforts to change that. Yeah, maybe one more thing that I wanted to talk about is technology. I think there's a lot of discussions today and nowadays about AI, and this also affects healthcare. So there's a lot of interest in healthcare and using algorithms to inform medical practice and to support healthcare workers in their jobs. But unfortunately, some of the biases that I've been talking about, there's a risk, I think, of those biases getting incorporated and embedded into algorithms. And this is actually already happening. So this is a study from 2019 where researchers identified racial bias in a quite widely used algorithm used to manage the health of populations. So it was an algorithm deciding who should be prioritized for care in hospitals in the US. And of course, it wasn't intended to be biased, but sometimes biases in our societies kind of get incorporated into algorithms. So what happened is that this algorithm was trying to use information about patients' healthcare costs to predict their future healthcare needs. And because of systemic racism, especially in the US, there are big inequalities in how much money different patients cost the system, and particularly black patients tend to generate lower costs. That's not because they're less ill, but because they have less access, for example, to healthcare, and they're underinsured, and there are other problems there in the US. And so because of that, this algorithm tended to prioritize less sick white patients over sicker black patients, and so it was perpetuating that kind of history and legacy of inequality in the system. Thankfully, there have been efforts to change that, and one of the researchers involved in the study has been working with the company who developed the algorithm to change how it works so that it focuses more on actual health and doesn't use cost as much as a proxy. And also, he's been doing work with other companies who have similar algorithms to try and change the way that they're designed so that we take this into account. So I think having awareness of these issues is really brilliant, because it means that we can start to change things and tackle the problem. And yes, I would love to use the remainder just to talk about some of the reasons why I feel really optimistic and hopeful about the future. So I think that by recognizing that racism is behind so much unfairness in health, it means that we can start to tackle the problem. And I think this is a problem that really affects all of us, whether or not we realize it. So, racism permeates medicine and science, but it also makes our healthcare systems not only deeply unfair, but also inefficient. It wastes time, money, and resources. I have so much respect for people working in healthcare, and actually a lot of the people who I've interviewed for my book who are really driving changes are people who are working in medicine and healthcare. You know, it's a caring profession. People want to help each other. And so, yeah, I think that by improving our healthcare system, this benefits all of us. But also, as I mentioned, increasing diversity in medical research is also beneficial because it means that the findings will hopefully be more beneficial for all of us. So I'm grateful that there are people working towards tackling these problems, and I wanted to just give a few examples before I'll stop talking and we can discuss. So you might have heard of Maloney Mukwende. He's a medical student based in London who kind of noticed the same problems that I spoke about at the beginning, that when he was being taught in medical school, a lot of the images and examples that he was being shown showcased conditions on lighter skin, and he was wondering, how does this look on skin like mine or on darker skin tones? And eventually he collaborated with his teachers at medical school to develop a handbook of clinical signs on black and brown skin. And I think it was quite challenging for him trying to find enough images and look at diverse conditions, but I think it was a really worthwhile project. Mind the Gap is the name of the handbook. It's freely available online. I think it's already helped a lot of medical professionals to kind of educate themselves about this issue, but also it's kind of just raised wider awareness, because I think we're in this age of kind of Dr. Google where we all try to diagnose ourselves. Maybe not always a good idea, but I do understand that need, that people want to advocate for themselves in healthcare and be able to recognize things on their skin. And so I think it's really helpful to have resources like this. And he also has a website, blackandbrownskin.co.uk, where you can look at images showing these conditions in different skin tones. And it's also really helpful for medical students and even more senior doctors who might want to refresh their knowledge or educate themselves about this. So I think that's really amazing. Also, so I talked about race-based medical practices, but I really wanted to highlight that a lot has changed even since my book kind of went to press. It's always tricky with nonfiction, you're trying to update it, but at some point you have to just let it go. But I think this is a really positive reason to have to update things, because actually things are changing. So when I was working as a journalist at New Scientist magazine, it's a science publication, I was in contact with NICE, so the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence. They set medical guidelines here in the UK. And they had a guideline to adjust kidney function tests based on the patient's race, particularly for black patients. And I was interviewing some nephrologists in London who told me that they've conducted research showing that this leads to poorer health outcomes for black patients. It essentially overestimates their kidney health so that they might not be prioritized for care in the case of chronic kidney disease, or even in very serious cases, it can make it more difficult for them to qualify for a kidney transplant, which of course is really a life and death situation. So this can really have an impact on patients. I got in touch with NICE in the course of my reporting for New Scientist, and initially it was a bit slow, but eventually when I shared this study with them, they said that they have decided to update their guidelines. So in 2021 they changed their guidelines and said they no longer recommend adjusting kidney function test results based on race. You know, kidneys work the same in everyone. It seems obvious, but some of these assumptions come from very small studies. For example, in the US, there was a study which included, it wasn't very large, but also the proportion of black people in that study was limited. But there was an assumption there that black people have more muscle mass and therefore we should adjust their test results. But since then, the consensus has really changed. A lot of doctors and researchers have moved against that. And similarly, when it comes to lung function testing, this is actually quite disturbing that recommendations to adjust lung function tests based on race, particularly for black patients, can be traced back to this idea from a physician in the US in the 1800s, who was also a slaveholder. He had this idea that black people's lungs are weaker and they therefore benefit from being enslaved. So you can really see in that context where there's enslavement of black people, there was effort to kind of justify the oppression of people in this era of kind of colonialism and transatlantic slavery, where there were these ideas that somehow have kind of persisted in medicine. And I think it's really positive that we're now interrogating that history and legacy and then questioning some of those guidelines. And so things have been changing in different fields of medicine. I think it would be great if we can see a broader reckoning within the whole of medicine about how are we using race and how we're taking care of diverse patients. I also wanted to highlight some of the work to include more diverse populations in medical studies, particularly in genetics research. There's the H3 Africa project, which has done a lot of work in last years. So there was research that identified millions of gene variants that had previously been missed, thanks to research that focused on diverse populations in Africa. But there are also projects in Asia, in the US, working with indigenous populations who've also traditionally been underrepresented in medical research. And in the US, there's the All of Us program, which aims to improve precision medicine by including more diverse populations in that work. I mean, the US and the UK are both very, diverse, multi-ethnic populations, so it's great to have more inclusion so that people can benefit from medical research. I also, this is kind of personal, but I think it can be helpful for people thinking, I think those of us who might have faced discrimination in healthcare, we want to be able to kind of advocate for ourselves, and this is something I really wanted to do with the book, is kind of just validate people's experiences. I think sometimes we might experience discrimination, but it's one of those things that's always tricky. People might say, oh, are you sure that was racism, or did that really happen? And I think it can be helpful just to see that there is actually a lot of evidence behind this, but also there are things that we can do to try and advocate for ourselves. So these are guidelines from an organization called 5 Times More here in England that campaigns for Black maternal health. And so they have on their website a list of recommendations for people, particularly people facing discrimination, so that they can advocate for themselves in their pregnancy. But I think this is relevant for all of us, just engaging with healthcare and being able to ask questions and just make sure that we understand recommendations. So this is actually something we talked about as well with blood pressure guidelines in the UK, recommending different treatments based on race, and just being able to ask questions and justify when we have these such recommendations. So yeah, I think of course we can do all the things I've mentioned. We can tackle bias in medicine. We can also advocate for ourselves in the healthcare setting. But I think beyond that, we want to think about our wider society and the environments we live in. And there are a lot of amazing people doing work in these areas as well. I mentioned Ella Deborah. Her mother Rosamond has a brilliant campaign for clean air in London and beyond. You can visit ellaroberta.org to learn more about that. But I think just advocating for clean air, clean water, environments free from discrimination, and also more equity within healthcare will be really beneficial to all of us. I think that if we can tackle racism in medicine, science, but also in our society, we'll be able to be happier and hopefully also healthier. So this is something I'm very passionate about. Thank you so much for listening. I'd love to have a discussion as well, hear your questions. Thank you so much. Excellent.
Yeah.
We'd love to.
So thank you so much, Layal. It was really, great to see some of the work that have been done by people around the topic. There are some things that I didn't know, that actually I was like, oh. So I think, like you say, this is a useful sort of book that might actually, encourage people to engage more with racism in medicine. So now this is for all of us. I'm opening the floor for any questions or discussions.
Quite a quick question. Thank you, that was really good.
Thanks.
The race-based testing in the US, specifically around dementia, do we do that in the UK?
Yeah, it's a good question. It was quite hard to actually find out because some things are really embedded into guidelines, and that's in a way easier to address because you can contact and say, let's change this guideline. Whereas there are some things which are almost like assumptions that are just,
right.
Like for example around pain, there are also a lot of assumptions that Black people feel pain differently, and sometimes these are passed on in medical school. So there have been medical students saying they've learned about these things, but yeah, it was difficult to get a sense of how widespread is that, and that's why I think it's important to have these conversations so that people can share. There's actually a really brilliant TikToker in the US but he also talks about racism in medicine globally. He's a medical student. His name is Joel Burville. I think he calls himself the medical mythbuster. And yeah, he's talked about how in school, that there's still sometimes things are being taught about pain perception, but also, about cognitive function, I think. So yeah, this may be more widespread. And also the US is quite influential in terms of international guidelines, and that's how, some of these kidney function guidance, it came from studies in the US, but it was then applied in the UK. And I think that's also an issue, is thinking about different populations around the world and trying to take assumptions from different countries and then translate them without really questioning them and asking about maybe the history of racism in the US or that is influencing that. But yeah, thanks. It's a really good question.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks. That was a really good talk. I had two questions. Where do you think there is a place for individualised medicine? So that's like a big thing in the NHS, and like looking at person-specific medicine rather than populations.
Yeah.
And do you think that if most of the studies are focusing on white populations, that's going to cause even greater inequalities, because most of the genetic testing is done on white populations, or I know there's lots of genetic testing going on in China and things like that, so do you think that will widen the gap, even if we're having individualised medicines? And then things like, I've noticed that NHS calculators just changed on BMI recently. So for Black and Asian people, it's 23 and above, which is quite hard as you age. So where's the place for things like that, or should we be challenging those things, or what's the? So from the research you've done, so and like I'm a clinician, and that kidney thing I've been doing for years without questioning it. But where's the line where you go, actually, how do you assess if that's race related? Is it that we go back to empirical research and say, well, this isn't applicable to our population? Like, how do we tackle those things? So, for example, how do we tackle the BMI calculator? Is that right to change it, or is it not? Or how would you tackle that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked, because I think this is something I was really grappling with in researching the book. It's like, how should doctors consider race? Because I'm definitely not an advocate for kind of colorblind medicine or something like that, because I think it's clear that our race affects our health in this way that racism affects our health. Because living in a racist society does influence people's outcomes, and depending on their particular experience of discrimination. And I think that should definitely be taken into account. When it comes to looking at biological differences, I think we should be much more careful. And I think often those differences are kind of overstated. Definitely, I'm not denying that there's huge genetic variation around the world. That's great, and we can learn from that, as I said. But I think that's more valuable on a population level. So when we're looking at differences across populations, it can be informative, because we might see variation that can tell us that a particular gene is involved in a disease, and variants of that gene, we can learn about that aspect of biology. But when it comes to an individual patient in front of us, I think it's more helpful to think about that patient. And for example, if we have access to sequencing data and genetics in the case of rare diseases, that's more helpful than trying to make general assumptions based on perception of their race. Or, I mean, even I was interviewing a GP in London the other day who was saying he doesn't even know how is he meant to decide a patient's race. What does he do if a patient is of mixed background? He was saying it's quite a mess, and it's not very consistent in terms of how that's used. So of course there might be correlations with race and genetics, but actually a lot of research shows that there's more variation within racial and ethnic groups or geographic groups compared to between those groups. And so I think it's important to be really careful how we use race or notions of race in medicine. I think a good example is sickle cell disease, which has very much been kind of labeled as a black disease, which has actually been really problematic, partly because of racism. That has meant that maybe resources were taken away from tackling that. But also in terms of diagnosis, so I should say that sickle cell can affect many populations. In fact, there's correlation between areas where sickle cell is prevalent, or the sickle cell trait, and areas where malaria is prevalent in the world, which is quite a big area. Of course, that includes a lot of Africa, but also Asia and Southern Europe and other areas. And so labeling that as a black disease isn't really helpful, because it might miss patients. Similarly with cystic fibrosis, it's kind of been seen as a white disease. Not helpful at all for black patients who are often underdiagnosed with CF. So I think it's important to think, and you mentioned also BMI, which I think for other reasons, not just about race, but it's also been criticized that it's not such a good tool. But I think sometimes what's missing is, that capturing that diversity of humanity. It's not to say that, a black patient is completely different from a white patient, but there is of course variation in populations. And I think when you have studies that are on such a narrow subset of the population, it's kind of a selection bias. So you might miss general variation that exists normally in the population. So I think it's important to consider that when in medicine, but also in medical research that informs that. Did I miss another part of your question? Please tell me that.
Hopefully, but no, I need
That's all right. Any other questions or discussion?
I'm thinking about policymakers and people like the World Health Organization. How advanced is their thinking, or are they still using old, outdated methods of perhaps planning population, healthcare systems or interventions? Where are they on this sort of thing?
Yeah, I think definitely in quite recent. So I think I put a slide from World Health Organization that I think it was in 2022. They had a report where they really more explicitly kind of named racism as a public health threat. And that sounds like a small thing, but actually just naming it is massive because I think a lot of the time it's almost like people want to avoid the word racism, and I think it is actually helpful sometimes to say what we're dealing with so that we can tackle that. So I think it does mean a lot when the World Health Organization and those prominent authorities that set guidance when it comes to public health, when they kind of highlight these problems, because then countries can look at their specific situation and tackle that. I've talked a lot about the UK today, but this exists a lot in every country. There's discrimination. In the book I also look, for example, at India and the caste system and discrimination. People might not call that racism. I interpret racism very broadly. There's a lot of different forms of discrimination. There's also discrimination against white ethnic groups here in the UK, but in other countries. So I think it's important to encompass all of that when we're thinking about health, because any type of discrimination is bad for our health. That you don't see benefits when it comes to health outcomes, especially when there are conditions. We've talked about HIV before, but there's stigma around conditions or around mental health. So I think it's important that organizations explicitly name that. I'm glad that the World Health Organization has been doing that more. But of course, it would be great to see more investment also at national level in different countries, considering their specific context, how racism operates in that country, and then also seeing, because I attended actually a couple of years ago a conference that was organized by the NHS Race and Health Observatory. So it's an independent organization, but it's also supported by NHS England. And there was someone from the NHS, like more senior, speaking there. I don't remember her name, but she talked a lot about these issues, and I think it's great that they were highlighting that. But in her whole talk, she didn't say the word racism. And at some point, she even said, "Oh, the 4 R's," and none of them were racism. We need to not be scared of this word. Like, it's okay to just acknowledge, because I think by mentioning and naming the problem, it means we can tackle it. And there's so many people doing great work to tackle this.
Can I, sorry, just on that, I noticed that Rosamund Kissy-Deborah, I heard her describe it as air quality apartheid.
Yeah.
And that lands because that's the only person I've ever heard describe, because of the work she's been doing. But air quality apartheid, when you say that to people, it does stop them, I think, to think about it.
Yeah, especially because I think air is something people almost don't think about. I was speaking with a doctor the other day who was saying, when he brings this up, that sometimes he feels working in medicine that, of course, you want to help people, but he said often people come into the clinic with problems that have started way before the point of care. It's the environment they're living in, and even we've talked about outdoor air pollution, but also indoor air pollution affects our health. So there are a lot of different ways that our health is affected before we kind of step into the clinic. And of course, I don't know if I emphasize this enough, but I'm a big admirer of people working in healthcare. It's a really caring profession. Also going through pregnancy, and I had quite a difficult birth. I was so grateful for the care that I had. I actually live in Germany now, but I received really, really great care, and I think I realized how much people care about these issues. And as you were saying in your question earlier, that doctors want to help, and I think sometimes people just don't know how should they approach this. And so I kind of wanted to break down that barrier or fear about talking about this. I'm sure I've maybe said the wrong thing, or it's always difficult when talking about racism, discrimination. But I think it's so much better to try and talk about these things, worrying less about am I using the right words and those things, just to get that conversation started and think what can we do to improve things.
Sorry, just to sort of let you into that question actually. For the World Health Organization, because for me, I think change there might mean a lot actually in terms of change trickling down to countries, because even in low and middle income countries, if you look at how health policy is made, they depend on the guidelines that they are given by the World Health Organization. So if you in the area that I work, if you talk about something, the immediate response is the WHO says.
Yeah,
so,
it's true.
So which means that they have a lot of influence. So in terms of this, besides naming it, what are they doing? Is there anything that they are actually doing in making sure that those guidelines that are trickling in these countries are cognizant of these things?
Yeah, so I think that there is good work. It can always be improved. I think we can always do more. But yeah, something that I was impressed by in terms of WHO, they obviously publish a lot of reports, and as you say, these are relied upon to kind of set the agenda for health priorities. Something that I explored in the book, which I think maybe isn't something that is talked about as much in health, but I think it is a health issue, is looking at colorism. And I think the WHO has done good work highlighting some of the ways that harms our health. So colorism meaning, discrimination based on skin shade. So this even operates within racial and ethnic groups. Often people with lighter skin might be given certain privileges, or there might be discrimination against darker skinned people. And that translates into a lot of different problems, but also health issues, because people will sometimes take very dangerous approaches to pursue kind of having lighter skin. And the WHO had a really interesting report looking at the use of illegal products containing toxins like mercury, which can really be harmful to all kinds of body systems in pursuit of lighter skin. And I think sometimes this has been a bit trivialized or dismissed as, it's just a beauty issue and women caring. And I think that's actually, I haven't started about sexism in health, but I think it's actually dismissive, because our skin tone, our skin shade, as well as our race, can have a huge impact on our social and economic opportunities. For the book, I interviewed a young woman in the Philippines who had a really terrible skin reaction because she used a product that had mercury. And when I asked her, why is it important to have lighter skin? She said, of course, you'll be treated better, you'll get better job opportunities. And so you can, in a way, you understand why people are doing this, but it's so sad that that's still a problem. And of course, there are companies that benefit from that, marketing skin lightening as a beauty ideal. So I think I like the fact that the WHO is highlighting those more specific issues in terms of racism. But I think, of course, we can always do better. And the WHO does have a big influence in setting policy, and especially when it comes, for example, even like within Africa, there are different countries where there might be ethnic inequalities. So I interpret racism broadly. Even in Ghana, where my parents are from, it's like between different tribes, there are tensions that can lead to inequality, also in health. So I think, recognizing racism in that broad international kind of sense will be really helpful, because it's an issue that I think anyway we should be tackling, like for moral reasons, but also thinking of it as a health issue, I think is helpful to guide policy and change.
Thank you so much for that. That was phenomenal. So ideas like black people feel less pain, they have more muscle mass or lower cognitive function, they are detrimental to our healthcare system. But where do they stem from? Where is the root and the source of those ideas?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think actually history is very important in a lot of this, and that can also help, I think, with medical education, having a bit more overlap between biology, medicine, and kind of the social sciences. There's been a lot more work, I think, in social sciences looking at the origin of some of these things. But yeah, to talk about differences in pain, there was a lot of work that happened in the 1800s, especially when there was transatlantic slavery and colonialism, where there was a lot of effort, I think, by scientists and doctors working in that era to try and justify enslavement and oppression, especially of black people, but in general of people of color in different countries around the world. And so ideas about pain, some of that has been traced to the US. There's also, I think, a physician, but a lot of physicians also had slaves, and there was a lot of overlap in this. I think his name was Thomas Hamilton. I might be getting this wrong. I think so. Yeah, he really did experiments to try and prove that black people's skin was thicker, therefore they feel pain differently, and did really horrific experiments on people, you know, with heat and trying to test their skin that left scars. And actually, luckily, we know about some of these things because one of the slaves that he kind of tested these ideas on ended up escaping to England, and he actually wrote a book. So often it's difficult with slavery to trace people's stories because they get lost. But yeah, he's kind of written about his experience. He said he was really scarred for life. It really affected him. And yeah, the idea that people feel pain differently. It's also in gynecology and the history. I think, yeah, there's been discussion about J. Marion Sims, who was kind of seen as this father of gynecology, but he also did experiments on enslaved black women that were, you know, without using anesthetic, and there were a lot of, you know, terrible things happened there. But that has also then informed sometimes medical practice today. So did I answer all? I think I mean, basically a lot of things can be traced actually, yeah, quite far back. It's surprising when you see, you know, as a scientist, you're looking at a study, you're looking at your sources, and as you're tracing it back, you're like, okay, this citation goes back here, and you're ending up in like the 1800s in some really problematic places in some cases. So yeah, I think we do need to be careful and just when you hear these assumptions about race, just question it and think, okay, does this make sense, or where does that idea come from? I think that even just that will make a big difference.
This is really more a comment than a question.
My mom is here as a plant.
But you know, we're naturally born curious beings. If you think of a baby, they always ask why. And I really think we need to connect with that and question things, rather than just accept and be spoon-fed and never question. So if I'm training as a doctor, pharmacist, counselor, whatever, if I'm fed a certain guideline and it doesn't feel right, then really it's important that we say, but why? How did this happen? What is the origin of it? That's how we learn and question and challenge something. We need to challenge more. I think this is really the thing in everything.
Fantastic. I think it answers one of the questions that I around. So do we know about these things? What do we do about it? Because, you know, like you mentioned, my own experience with hypertension, when I came to the UK, I was made to understand that with my hypertension, my care is different to that is provided to a white person. And I was like, why? To the doctor. They didn't have any explanation for me. They said the guidelines say, but you are the medical professional. You are the medical professional and you can't tell me why. My care is different to that. I'm still being given care that is different to a white person because the guidelines, you know, say so. But if you ask the medical, I have friends in the, you know, pharmacists, doctors in the UK, you know, if you ask them, they will tell you that that's show the science. But they're still prescribing, they're still dispensing without really, you know, asking why, you know, is it because if it's coming from a medical professionals, even ourselves, I think, if you have a cohort of people asking why, you know, you might increase your chances of making a difference. But it looks like people are comfortable in
and also I do understand that if you're practicing medicine, we want to be able to rely on guidelines. And sometimes doctors have told me that they're worried because they don't want to be accused of not following the guidelines. So I completely understand that is difficult. And also I really don't think the onus should be always on those of us who are being discriminated against to have to kind of educate our doctor, right? That's not at all. I really hope that we can all kind of be more educated about these things and then change. That's also why I called the book systemic, because I think a lot of this is about systems. I think I've been doing some interviews and things with media, and I think a lot of people want me to say, oh, this one doctor is racist, and fire that person, and it's all their fault. But I just think that's just not true. Maybe it's not as like, I don't know, catchy, but I do think it's the systems, it's our society, it's all these things. People care, and you know, I think it's great to have the NHS in the UK. That's something that means that you have universal access to healthcare, because in the US it's like, these things are even amplified by, of course, the inequality and just even accessing sometimes basic care. But yeah, no, I think it's great. Of course, we want to challenge these things, but sometimes I think you shouldn't need to have like a PhD or be an expert in everything in order to receive good care. It's like we all deserve good health care and to understand the care that we're being given. Yeah.
I think you first, and then we will come to back.
I was just going to lead on to what you were saying. Do you feel like actually the change needs to happen on the evidence-based level? So, like an individual doctor, like you're saying, they just follow the guidelines. They're just following a logarithm. They're not making very narrow personal judgments. Yeah. They're just following guidelines. So is it a case of this research needs to influence how we actually do research? Like, so drug trials need to include Black, Asian people, otherwise they don't come onto the market. And even guidelines themselves, you might have a COPD guideline that's not reviewed for 5 years. So once guidance is out, it's out. So then it's not on the individual pharmacist or doctor, we just follow the guidelines. Yeah. So it's really, it's upstream work rather than clinician work, because they're just in the system following the guideline. It's not really, the patient sees the doctor, but they're just following the guideline. Yeah. It's the research work, who's in the clinical trials, that's where the change needs to happen, I would say.
I think actually both are really important, because doctors have a lot of power to kind of say, look, we're the ones like on the front line seeing patients and observing the problems with this guideline. So I think definitely it's great if doctors could kind of like feed that back. And say, oh, this doesn't make sense. So there's actually a GP I've been in contact with who's kind of been for years lobbying NICE to reconsider their guideline actually on hypertension. So it's exactly what you were talking about. And he's kind of gone to the lengths to review the evidence and everything. But of course he's a busy GP, and we know all the pressures on the NHS. And so I agree with you that it's really important also there are people who their whole focus is on doing research to actually monitor health inequality, which sometimes it feels like, oh, we're just kind of documenting disparities in health. But I think it is important to have that data because firstly it justifies and kind of validates people's experiences in health and in healthcare, but also it can allow, it's an argument to prioritize resources and funding towards changing guidelines or identifying problems that we can fix. I think that's important. But yeah, I do think research is crucial, including more people. I think the focus is often on, there's variation in populations and we should capture that. And I think that's of course true. But it is important to put that into perspective because as I said, it's like 99.9% of our DNA is the same. We're looking at small differences. I think the bigger thing is thinking about how we benefit from being included in medical research. If you have cancer and maybe you want to access a clinical trial where they're testing a new treatment, it's so important to see more diversity there because clinical trials are still not diverse enough, mainly participants are white, and so allowing people to have opportunities to access that kind of cutting edge research and potential medical care I think is also really important.
Yeah. Just to highlight that funders are trying also, like funders of research are trying to encourage diversity. So now, for most funders, when you apply for funding for medical research, they'll ask you about how you are going to make sure that you have representatives in your samples. So they'll actually ask you about the quotas, that you have for black people.
That you're including people.
Are you including the people that are relevant to this? So I think, if we all try, including the funders, it might sort of force us to move in the right direction, isn't it, in terms of how we think about medical research and also how that fits into guidelines.
Yeah, and even just all of us, I think it's not just people working in healthcare, but just, I talked a little bit about just how racism in daily life is causing stress, but also more acute experiences can cause trauma. In the book, I write about the experience of Darnella Frazier, who is the teenager who witnessed the murder of George Floyd in the US by a police officer. So really an acute kind of instance of racial trauma. And she's talked about how that was traumatic for her. And there's also research showing that even second-hand experiences, so just witnessing video footage, for example, of these horrific incidents can really affect, especially Black people, but in general, people belonging to marginalized groups. So I think, also thinking about how all of us, just in our daily interactions, just in our life, like with our friends, colleagues, even within families, for example, when it comes to colorism, how are we kind of interacting and how can we hopefully boost each other's health? I really think this is good for all of us. It's like, wouldn't we all want to just live in a happier, healthier kind of society? So I would say most of the reaction I have is really positive. People care about this, and I think people are now in this space where it's like, what can we do? We can teach doctors to recognize health conditions of diverse skin tones, remove bias from algorithms and from medical research. And also, just all advocate for ourselves and our health, whatever our background, just demanding fair treatment and engaging with our healthcare providers as well.
Oh, thank you. So I'm part of a community group and we support people of colour in York. And we
Thank you for your work.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, so there's lots of it. And so we get regular emails from GPs, people, researchers and whatnot, emailing us being like, can we talk to your community? Can we talk to your group? Can we do this? Can we do that? And it's a lot of health stuff. Now, I read these emails and I think, who are you? What are you trying to do? There's this distrust straight away. I'm immediately like, I don't really respond, or I just look and think, how can I be sure that these people aren't going to cause harm to our community? And so from my end, it's like, how can I, because I read the emails, how can I kind of do my due diligence to make sure that maybe they're not going to cause harm to our community? I don't know if you've got any thoughts.
Yeah, I do understand that. I think during COVID, I was reporting on ethnic inequalities in COVID, but also in vaccination uptake. And there was a bit, sometimes I had this feeling that there was, particularly for Black people, but other ethnic groups, that there was vaccine hesitancy. It was almost like, it's their own fault that they're not taking the vaccine. And I think that fails to kind of understand the root causes of some of that mistrust. So I think it's good that you mentioned it, and it's important to think about that. And I think, of course, it's great that people want to engage. I think we should have those conversations and try and open that door, because if we don't talk, we'll just never go anywhere. But maybe you can act as kind of a first step, like talking to the doctors and seeing what do they want to do, what are the important issues in the community that they want to tackle, and then thinking, I think it's great when, if you want to help a community, it's good to work with the community. It's not this top-down kind of approach or doctor knows best, and that hierarchy I think isn't helpful. I think it's great if you can just talk like normally, as we're talking now, just having those conversations is helpful. But I understand your instinct, of course, and I think a lot of people have that sort of apprehensive feeling, maybe because they've had also difficult experiences or experienced discrimination in care. So I hope that we can be able to share those experiences more, so that everyone realizes, in healthcare, but also beyond, how those interactions are affecting people.
I think I'll just send them a link to your book. It's systemic. There you go. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Can I kind of jump onto the back of that? I'm one of the people that sends the annoying email.
This is great.
That I ignore, sorry.
Not to you specifically, I hasten to add, I work in a local to this, but not this health area. And we do have an issue of how do we have those conversations, and if you listen to kind of guidance from the higher NHS, it's almost go and talk to everybody in the mosque. Well, they've got other things to do, and also they don't represent everybody, they just represent the people involved in that mosque. But trying to make those connections is genuinely, I would love to know how to reach out in an appropriate way, because even within the organisation I'm in, I could kind of list a number of different people who want to talk to the same small few groups that are doing that kind of work. And they're busy doing the work, they haven't got time to spend all of their time connecting to us, never mind all the other NHS bodies or the local authority or the people that are coming up to see their nationally recognised scheme, what have you. We are distracting them from the core work. But how do we have those conversations? How do we hook in somehow?
Yeah, and actually, I think you brought a good point that I didn't mention before. I think I highlighted some organizations as well, like 5 times more, that are campaigning for Black maternal health. But some of these organizations are just kind of self-funded, or they rely on donations. And I think it would be amazing to see a bit more, because as you said, people are busy, they don't have time. What if you actually hired someone who that's their job, we paid them for their work, and value the contribution that they're giving? Like, I think it would be great if there's more investment also from even like from government or higher to kind of, it's a bit like what we said with the WHO, that sometimes that validates also, it shows that we value this work, it's important to us. And it comes back, anyone who's experienced NHS waiting times, I think should care about this issue. It affects everyone. Making healthcare more efficient, improving health for all communities benefits everyone. So it is worth investing in, I think it's important. But yes, I think it's great that now I think we should be less scared to have these conversations. Let's be less scared of words like racism, because I think when we hear racism, it's like we think, oh, it's like, am I a racist? But of course, we all have biases, right? But I think it's less about that. Thinking about systems and how we can change them together, it maybe takes away that fear and worrying about saying something wrong. I think I encourage people to just start talking, and also just to ask, as you just did. I think that's so. I loved your question, and that you're asking, what can we do? Where are there areas where we can help? What's appropriate? I think that's great, and I really value the work both of you that you're doing. So thank you so much. Thank you for just being here at this talk. I think it's great that you're obviously interested in this issue and you care. So I think that means so much, and it's so nice to meet you both. And thank you for your interest.
So I realize that we are in time, but I just wondered, we have colleagues who are working EDI in the back, and I think when we came, when I was speaking to them, something struck me around, there was a sort of a documentary type thing that I saw on television, where someone was interviewing young people, or black or brown, people of color, but young people. And their experience was, these issues are not about racism at all, it's about your postcode, where you live.
Because
yes, it's all the same. But that's their experience, isn't it? Because they are living in communities where it's a poor community, whether you're white, whether you're brown, whether you're black. You are being affected by the same issues, and that's their experience. So you can't deny their experience. So how do you entangle? How do you explain that to because to me it's obvious that race is it's like you are seeing what is on the surface, but the origin is actually racism. To me,
of course, like historical. And that's something that has come up a bit. I won't talk too long because I know there's time. But during COVID, there was discussion that people of color are being worse affected, but that's because they're poor, or black people are poor, that's why they have worse health. Firstly, I'm thinking that's not okay. It shouldn't be, because it is true. Being poor is terrible for your health, and it's true that black people are disproportionately, there's economic inequality. But if we think about the root cause of that, often it is connected to racism, historical racism, because in this country, but in other countries, we know the whole history of colonialism and exploitation that's happened, but also just present day. I mean, it's crazy that still, in this day and age, it's like you apply for a job, if you have a, so-called ethnic sounding name or black sounding name, Asian sounding name, it can influence your opportunities in that way. So it's something that is still affecting, economic opportunities. But I think, again, I don't see this as like either or. Like when I hear, it's like, I do think we should tackle, poverty and inequality. That's a central part for me of this whole thing. I think it's connected. It's the same when it comes to tackling climate change and the environmental racism. I think these issues are actually very much connected, and it's kind of almost a lie that sometimes we hear being told, especially by politicians, that as if you need to choose one thing to tackle. When actually, if these problems are linked, by tackling one, you're tackling the other. So I think if you are tackling economic inequality, environmental inequality, you're also addressing racism and the legacy of racism. So yeah, thanks so much for mentioning that.
Thank you so much, and thank you, Layla, for
Thank you. It's been
fascinating
such a
talk.
lovely conversation here. Thank you so much for coming and for your interest.
And I'd like to thank the audience as well for
thank
your really rich discussion. And I'm sure many of you would want to get hold of the book. And I understand that it is available now, isn't it?
Oh yes, so it was published a couple of days ago. So for me, it's out in the world. It's been like in my head quietly for a while, but now, everyone can read and learn more. Yeah.
So it's available to buy from our independent bookseller, Foxman Book. That's what I've been told. And I've been told that you're okay with signing books.
Oh, yeah. Please, I'd love to have more questions and want to come say hello to me.
So Layla will be there for book signing if anyone wishes to have a signed book. I think I've seen the copies just in the section.
Yeah, I'll make sure to hang around.
Yes, and thank you so much for attending today's session. And be sure to check out, the Young Festival of Ideas is still on. And so be sure to check out what we have in store in the program. So another round of